In the still heat of a Texas morning, the train hissed like a wounded animal. 22 pairs of eyes, narrow with exhaustion and suspicion, blinked at the light spilling across the platform. They had crossed the ocean in chains, crossed a continent in silence, and now stepped onto the sunburnt earth of Huntsville. Not as soldiers, not as women, but as prisoners. Japanese, female, and feared. The guards said nothing. The local civilians whispered plenty. It was August 1945. Hiroshima had burned. Nagasaki had burned. The Emperor had spoken the unthinkable. And in the pine woods of East Texas, the war was ending. But no one told the women that. No one told them anything at all. They came from scattered corners of the defeated empire. Some clerks, some nurses, a few interpreters, one radio operator. Most had been captured in the Philippines, brought to Guam, interrogated, then sent across the Pacific on Liberty ships. They wore standard-issue khaki, stiff, boxy, ill-fitting. Their hair, once immaculately arranged, now hung limp in the humidity. Their boots, if they had any at all, clacked softly against the platform wood like bones knocking. They had been told to expect cruelty, filth, shame. The Americans, they'd been told, were monsters in uniform. Sons of industrial corruption, lovers of soft living, incapable of honor or discipline. And Texas, they had heard, was the wild place, full of cowboys and lynchings and madness. But what they found was quiet. No jeers, no spitting. Just the heavy breath of the forest and the crickets sounding off like faraway typewriters. A truck waited at the platform, olive drab, canvas-covered. A U.S. Army sergeant, brown-skinned, lean, wearing mirrored sunglasses, simply gestured, "Get in." No barking orders, no rifle prodding, just that flat palm, that small courtesy. It was the first rupture in the wall they carried. The ride into Camp Huntsville passed beneath pine boughs, dripping with cicada hum. The dirt roads carved brown ribbons through the trees. When the truck turned past the gate, the women stiffened again. Rows of wooden barracks, watchtowers, men in uniform, fences crowned with curling wire. American flags flapped slowly under the hard sky. But there were also strange things. Flower beds, a small chapel, a baseball diamond. White men and black men working side by side. And laughter, not mocking, just casual. As if none of this were a prison at all. One of the prisoners, a thin woman from Nagoya named Yuki, whispered aloud without meaning to. "Where are the whips?" No one answered. But someone near her, another prisoner named Michiko, quietly reached for her hand. Not out of fear, but confusion. They were assigned a female guard named Corporal Julia Thompson. Mid-30s, hair tucked tight under her cap. Southern drawl like molasses over gravel. She didn't carry a weapon, just a clipboard. "You'll be on work duty," she said. "Lumber station detail. Mornings, mostly. No trouble, you won't have trouble." A few of the women looked at each other. They had worked before, for the war for the Emperor. But this wasn't for Japan. This was for the enemy. A barracks was assigned. Wooden, clean, with cots lined up like regimented ghosts. There was a wash basin, a mirror, and soap. Real soap. Not the gray powder they'd used on ships. Not ash and fat mixes from the jungle. It smelled of lemon. The youngest among them, Haru, touched it like a relic. She had never used soap that wasn't rationed by a corporal. The night came quiet and heavy. Outside, frogs called like lost spirits. Inside, the women whispered about home, not Tokyo or Osaka or Hiroshima, but memories further back. Rice paddies, tea shops, lullabies. Some had families who still didn't know they were alive. Some had husbands presumed dead. Some had only the war. But one thing was shared. They were alone here. That night, they expected the darkness to turn violent, expected boots at the door. They slept in shifts, eyes open. But nothing came. Only the scent of pine, only the far-off murmur of American voices talking about baseball and ration coupons and something called Lumberjack Day. And in the pale morning light, when the truck came again, when the guard said, "Let's go, girls," in that rough but strangely gentle tone, they followed. None dared say it aloud yet, but something was already crumbling. The war had taught them to harden their hearts, but Texas greeted them with silence, with trees, with space to think, and something, though they didn't yet know the word, something like mercy, and something, though they didn't yet know the word, something like mercy. The second day began with dust, the kind that hangs in the morning air, like powdered copper, rising from beneath tires and boots as the army truck rumbled past the rows of barracks and out through a service gate toward the edge of the pine forest. The women sat along the wooden benches in the truck bed, swaying with the turns, the canvas above them flapping rhythmically like breath. They held onto their lap seams, silent. None asked where they were going, but all of them watched, eyes narrow, jaws set, as the road turned into packed dirt and the woods grew denser. At a small clearing, a long tin-roofed shed came into view. Beyond it, men, tall, loud, laughing in bursts that echoed off the trees. The rhythmic thud of axe heads biting wood filled the air like a heartbeat. This was the Huntsville Lumber Cooperative, and these were the first Texans. The prisoners were told nothing, only that they were to assist in sorting planks, loading carts, sweeping sheds, and boiling coffee water for the sawmen. Their U.S. overseer was a civilian named Walt Redding, a stooped, gray-mustached foreman with forearms like rope and a voice made of bark. He didn't wear a gun. He didn't speak Japanese. But he looked each of them in the eyes as if they were people. He pointed. He mimed. He showed them how to work the lifts and how not to drop timber on their feet. Then he stepped back and let them work. It was Michiko who first noticed. The men. Not guards, not soldiers, just lumberjacks. American lumberjacks. And they were like creatures from another world, where Japanese men were lithe, angular, built for speed and precision. These men were carved from redwood and smoke. Shirts off in the heat, they moved through sawdust like bulls through fog. Shoulders wide, torsos bronzed, hair matted with sweat and sap. They swung axes like they weighed nothing. One man, grinning, split a stump with a single blow and turned to wink at Haru, who turned crimson and looked away, ashamed. These were not the soft, corrupt men they had been taught about. These men were sunburnt, sure-footed, powerful, and, perhaps most shocking, they were gentle. No catcalls, no whistles. Some looked, yes, but the looks were not cruel, just curious. Yuki caught one of them watching her stack pine boards with steady hands. He didn't leer. He simply nodded, as if to say, "You work hard." That nod broke something in her chest. She didn't even know his name. The women were given breaks. Water in tin cups, coffee in blackened kettles. One morning, as the heat pressed down and the cicadas screamed louder than ever, Walt handed Michiko a small bar of chocolate, halved. "Here," he said, tapping his fingers to his lips. "You, eat." She took it, slowly, suspicious, then tasted it. Bitterness, sweetness, fat, sugar. She blinked hard. It had been years. She turned to the others. Harue, Tomiko, Yuki. And without speaking, she broke off pieces and passed them down the line. No one spoke. But they chewed like it was communion. That night in the barracks, someone, it may have been Haru, whispered, "They are not what we were told." The others said nothing, but many did not sleep. They stared at the ceiling, at the slow turning fan, at the tiny shadow of a spider crawling above the lamp. They were rethinking everything. The next day, one of the lumberjacks brought a radio. It played country music, slow and aching. A man's voice sang about rivers and wind and losing something you never deserved to hold. The Japanese women didn't understand the words, but the melody was a kind of ache they knew. And one of the men, tall, red-haired, probably Irish, started humming along. His axe paused mid-swing. The women looked up. He smiled. They did not smile back. Not yet. But something moved behind their eyes. By the end of the first week, they no longer flinched when the truck door slammed. They no longer kept their hands in their laps. They stood straighter, and they watched the men, and the men watched them. And between the sweat and sawdust and steam, there was something growing, uneven, unspoken, human. At dinner, they talked quietly about the names of the tools, about the sweat stains on the lumberjack shirts, about how one man's voice cracked when he laughed. "They are like wild oxen," Tomiko said, almost wistfully. "Oxen don't smile," replied Yuki. And someone, maybe Michiko, said it in a voice so soft they nearly missed it. "I want to marry a lumberjack." The others gasped, scandalized. Then, laughter, real laughter, unforced, not cruel. It filled the barracks like wind through dry grass. No one reported it, and no one forgot it, because in that moment, the idea of enemy cracked open, and inside was only the human. The third week brought the first rain. It came without warning, a sudden, hard drumming that turned the red earth to clay and blurred the pine line into gray watercolor. The lumberjacks kept working, of course. They swung axes through the mist as if the sky itself had challenged them. The Japanese women were ordered to shelter under the tin roof of the sorting shed, but even from there they could see it. The rhythm of men against nature. Water poured down their faces, slicking their arms and backs. Each movement of the axe was a ritual, each breath heavy as thunder. The women watched in silence, the sound of the rain mingling with the thud of blade against wood. Haru whispered, "They don't stop." No one answered. The thought was heresy. For years, they had been told that Americans were decadent, too spoiled by comfort to endure hardship, too fragile for labor. Yet here they were, bare-chested in the storm, turning trees into towers of split pine, singing over the roar of the weather. When the rain finally broke, steam rose from their bodies like ghosts leaving the battlefield. Something stirred in Michiko then. Not admiration, not desire, but recognition. The same rhythm of struggle she had seen in the rice paddies of her childhood, in her father's hands, in the unspoken faith that work was prayer. But the indoctrination still lived in them. That night, as they dried their uniforms on the barrack lines, Tomiko spoke the words everyone else had avoided. "We cannot forget who we are." Her tone was sharp, like a knife scraping bone. "Do you think these men would look at you the same if you weren't prisoners?" The silence that followed was deep. Only the squeak of water dripping from the ceiling punctuated it. Yuki looked up from her cot. "Then what are we now, if not prisoners?" Tomiko turned away. "Ghosts," she said. "But even ghosts can feel warmth." The next morning, the lumber foreman Walt called for volunteers. The saw had jammed in the mill pit, and they needed hands small enough to reach inside the gears. Without hesitation, Michiko stepped forward. Walt looked surprised. "You sure, miss?" She nodded once, firm. It took an hour. Grease, grit, her thin arms reaching into the machine's metal heart. But when the gears finally turned, the entire shed erupted with cheers. Walt clapped her on the shoulder. "Good job, darlin'. You just saved us a day's work." The word darlin' struck her like sunlight through clouds. That night, she washed her hands 3 times, as if trying to scrub away the warmth it left. But she smiled. Only a little. Only to herself. Days turned into a pattern. Morning. The truck ride, the laughter of the men, the smell of resin and smoke. Afternoon. Hauling planks, mending rope, sweeping sawdust. Evening. The long walk back, pine shadows stretching like old memories. The women began to pick up English words. Water. Careful. Good. One of the lumberjacks, the red-haired one who'd winked at Haru, started teaching them small phrases, scratching letters into the dirt with a stick. They laughed at his accent. He laughed at theirs. Language, once a wall, became a bridge made of gestures and smiles. And through it all, the myth unraveled. Then came the letter. Corporal Julia Thompson entered the women's barracks one evening, cap in hand, face solemn. "The war's over," she said quietly. "Your emperor surrendered." No one breathed. It was as if the world stopped spinning. The youngest, Haru, dropped the comb she was holding. It clattered to the floor and rolled beneath the cot. Tomiko sank down on her knees, eyes empty. For the others, disbelief turned to numbness. Numbness to something wordless. Not grief, not anger, but a hollow collapse of meaning. Michiko whispered, "Then what are we now?" Corporal Thompson hesitated, then said softly, "Alive." The next morning at the lumber yard, the mood was strange. The Americans knew the news too. VJ Day had reached Texas. Some men cheered, some prayed. Some just stood still, staring at the sky, as if waiting for the ghosts of the war to pass overhead. Walt gathered the women and said, "You don't have to work today. The camp's given you rest." But they refused. Every single one. "Work," Yuki said, her English fractured but firm. "We work." And so they did. Axes rose and fell again. The sound of wood cracking became a requiem. For Hiroshima, for Nagasaki, for all the things lost and unnamed. When the red-haired lumberjack passed Haru a cup of cold water, she bowed deeply. He didn't understand the words she spoke, but he saw the tears in her eyes. He took off his hat, held it over his heart, and nodded. The sun caught his hair, and for a moment, in that small exchange, there was no victory, no defeat, only recognition. That night, the women didn't speak much. The barracks felt too quiet, too fragile. But before lights out, someone began to hum, a soft, trembling melody from home. Others joined in, one by one, until the sound filled the room like incense. Outside, in the distant darkness, a lumberjack paused his night shift, listening. He couldn't understand the tune, but he felt it. He leaned on his axe handle, looked toward the women's quarters, and whispered to himself, "We've never seen women like this." And somewhere inside those barracks, Michiko, half asleep, thought the same. We've never seen men like them. The days after the surrender drifted like smoke, without direction, without wind. For the first time since the emperor's words, the women no longer knew who they were meant to serve. They woke at dawn by habit, folded their blankets by habit, marched to the trucks by habit. But their purpose, once bright and fierce, had gone silent. It was the work that kept them breathing, the rhythm of it, the sound of saws slicing through pine, the smell of sap and sweat. The world here obeyed no emperor, no ideology, only effort, only gravity. At the lumber yard, the men spoke less now. They too seemed humbled by the word peace. The air carried a strange mixture of relief and guilt. Some of the lumberjacks had sons in uniform, some had already buried them. War's shadows stretched even across this quiet Texas forest. One morning, Walt Redding motioned the women over to the edge of the yard. "New task today," he said. "Sorting offcuts for the camp schoolhouse." A schoolhouse. The word stirred something unexpected. Children. Books. Chalkboards. The future. They began stacking small timber squares, brushing away dust, arranging them like puzzle pieces. Haru, barely 20, paused to trace a fingertip along the grain of one board. "For children," she murmured in Japanese. "This wood will become a wall that keeps out rain." Walt didn't understand her words, but he watched the tenderness in her motion. "Good job, sweetheart," he said softly, then tipped his hat. The simplicity of that praise felt heavier than metals. That afternoon, the foreman let them rest early. The men gathered near the canteen, wiping their faces with rags, drinking from tin cups. One of the older lumberjacks, a barrel-chested man named Hank, pulled out a harmonica. The tune he played was slow, something like a lullaby caught between sorrow and joy. The prisoners listened from the shade. Yuki leaned against a post, eyes half closed. She thought of her father humming a similar tune on their veranda before the war. Different melody, same ache. When the song ended, Michiko did something none of them expected. She clapped, once, then twice. The sound echoed like a gunshot. The men turned, startled, then grinned. A few of them clapped back. Harue blushed. Tomiko looked away, pretending disapproval but hiding a smile. That small exchange was the first time the air between them filled with something other than caution. As August bled into September, the heat softened. Work became easier, laughter less rare. The women began to hum while sweeping. The men started teaching them words: tree, sky, friend. In return, Michiko taught them ki, sora, tomodachi. The red-haired lumberjack tried pronouncing it. Tomodachi. The women burst out laughing. He laughed too, raising his hands in surrender. All right, you win. And that was the moment when enemies began to sound like neighbors. Later that week, rain returned, heavy and slow. The women stayed in the barracks while the men hauled logs through the mud. When thunder rolled over the hills, the women crowded by the window, watching them labor in the storm. One man slipped, fell into the pit near the saw platform. The others rushed to him, shouting, hauling him out by the arms. Without thinking, Michiko ran out into the rain, ducking beneath the fence gap, barefoot through puddles. The guards shouted, but she didn't stop. She reached the fallen man, blood streaming down his forearm, a deep cut. She tore her sleeve, pressed it against the wound. He looked up, eyes wide. "You don't have to." She didn't understand the words, but the tone was enough. She shook her head, held the cloth firm. The foreman ran over, helping him to his feet. "Get her inside before she catches cold." By the time she was back in the barracks, soaked and trembling, the other women stared at her as if she'd broken a sacred law. "Why did you help him?" Tomiko asked. Michiko sat on her cot, dripping water onto the floor. "Because he was bleeding." Tomiko's mouth tightened. "He is the enemy." Michiko looked up, eyes steady. So was I. The room fell silent. Outside, thunder faded into soft rain. Days later, the injured man, his name, they learned, was Jack, came to the barracks with a sling on his arm. He stood awkwardly near the fence while Corporal Thompson supervised. He said something in English, fumbling for words, then held up a small carving, a pine bird, roughly whittled, its wings uneven. "For you," he said, nodding toward Michiko. "Thank you." The guards allowed her to step forward. She took it in both hands, bowed low. Jack smiled. "You, friend." The word sounded strange, fragile, like a leaf in wind. But it carried warmth. Later that night, Michiko placed the small wooden bird beside her pillow. The grain caught the lamplight, and she thought, not of war, not of victory or shame, but of the simple truth that kindness was the only language that never lied. As autumn came, the forest around Huntsville turned golden. The workdays shortened. Rumors spread that the prisoners might soon be sent home. The thought should have brought relief. Instead, it felt like loss. They had arrived believing the world outside the fence was cruel. They would leave knowing that cruelty was not the whole truth. One evening, as the sun dropped low and painted the yard in amber, Walt called out, "Pack it up, ladies. Day's done." The women gathered their tools. Yuki looked once more at the men laughing by the woodpile, the air smelling of smoke and pine. She turned to Michiko and whispered, "Back home they told us Americans have no soul." Michiko smiled faintly, tucking the wooden bird into her pocket. Then maybe they never met a man from Texas. The truck engine coughed to life. Dust rose in swirls. The road home stretched ahead, long and quiet. Behind them, the lumberjacks raised their hands in farewell. And for the first time since captivity began, the women waved back. It was in late September, just as the first chill arrived in the morning air, that the women began using their names again. Not their ranks, not their roles, not the numbers stenciled onto their laundry tags. Names like petals that had closed during a storm and were now unfolding in the quiet sun. Until then, even among themselves, they had spoken in titles: nurse, clerk, interpreter. It had been safer that way. A name could be taken from you. A name could die with a wrong answer in an interrogation room or disappear under a bayonet. But something had changed. No orders were given, no permission sought. It just began, like the wind shifting over the pines. "Michiko-san," Harue whispered one morning, pointing to a splinter in her hand. "Help?" Michiko looked up from the water pump, blinked, and smiled. "Hi, Michiko will help." It felt strange at first, intimate, soft. Later that day, one of the lumberjacks, the red-haired man whose name they now learned was Ben, scratched his name into the dirt with a stick. "Ben," he said proudly, tapping each letter. He handed the stick to Haru. She hesitated, then bent down and slowly drew Harue. He repeated it aloud. "Ha! Ru, hey, close enough." She giggled. He laughed. Not at her, with her. From that moment on, the days took on a different hue. Not brighter, not yet, but warmer. The kind of warmth that lingers even after the fire's gone. In the lumber yard, things moved slower. The war effort had ended, so production eased. Fewer logs came in. The saws rested longer. Walt began assigning smaller jobs: sanding, planing, fixing tools. With less pressure, conversations grew. They started with questions, in broken English and clumsy gestures. "You family? Before war, what, work? Why, Texas?" Ben told them he had been a teacher once, before joining the war effort. Walt had run a general store. Jack, the man Michiko had helped, had lost a brother on Saipan. The women listened. Some cried silently when the men spoke of loss. Some nodded, understanding that grief spoke every language. And then the women began to share too. Michiko described the plum trees behind her father's home in Kyoto. Harue spoke of her dream to become a midwife. Yuki, once the most guarded, finally told Ben that she had worked at a radio station in Nagasaki, before the city vanished in light. He did not ask more. He only bowed his head, and she bowed back. Two silences, mourning the same absence. That Sunday, Walt did something unexpected. He invited the women to the edge of the lumber camp for a picnic. Not inside the fence, not in the barracks. A picnic under the trees. The guards hesitated. Command wasn't sure. But Walt spoke firmly. "They've earned it," he said. "It's just food and air, nothing more." So they went, with folded blankets and small crates as tables. Tin cups of coffee, slices of cornbread. Even a jug of peach preserves passed from hand to hand. No one played music. No one toasted victory. There was no flag, no anthem, no speeches, just shared food and shared silence. And in that silence, something profound settled over them all. Not forgiveness, not forgetting, but a kind of peace that required no signatures. Yuki took a spoonful of peaches and held it to her lips. Her eyes fluttered closed. The taste of something sweet, unmeasured, unearned, filled her mouth like memory. When she opened her eyes, Ben was watching her. He did not smile. He only nodded once, solemnly, as if to say, "You are alive. That is enough." The next day, the women returned to work with a new rhythm. They began braiding their hair again. They tucked flowers behind their ears. Not for the men, for themselves. Tomiko, who had always been the most rigid, began teaching the guards origami during rest breaks. She folded paper cranes out of scrap ledger paper and handed them to young MPs who didn't know what to say. One corporal kept his in his shirt pocket for weeks. The men started bringing things too. Not gifts, just small tokens. A harmonica left on a bench. A pocket knife loaned and returned. A photograph of a family, passed around quietly during lunch. These were not grand gestures. They were human ones. And that was enough. One morning, as they waited for the truck, Harue turned to Michiko and said, "Do you think if we had met them before the war, it would be like this?" Michiko didn't answer at first. She watched the fog rise from the field like steam from a teacup. "No," she finally said. "But maybe, if we had met their mothers." Haru looked confused. Michiko continued softly. "Men do not start wars. Boys become men in them. But the ones who teach them love are always women." Haru nodded slowly, understanding. "Like you taught me." They said nothing more. But when the truck arrived, they climbed in not as prisoners, not as enemies, but as something in between, something no nation could name. That evening, under a moon that hung low and warm over Texas, Ben passed Michiko a folded piece of paper. She opened it. A pencil sketch, crude but unmistakable. A bird, just like the one he had carved weeks ago. But this one had wings spread wide. Below it, one word, "Fly." She held it for a long time, then traced her name next to his. Gently, carefully. Two names, side by side in silence. For the first time in years, Michiko imagined a future. Not grand, not political. Just one in which her name could be spoken aloud. Softly, kindly, by someone who meant it. October settled over Huntsville with the scent of wood smoke and wet pine. The leaves browned and drifted across the lumber camp like forgotten letters. Change was everywhere. In the air, in the trees, and in the faces of the women who once clung to silence like armor. Now they lingered during their shifts. They spoke without whispering. And more they smiled without shame. But with each passing day, one truth grew harder to ignore. Soon they would be sent home. Home. A word that no longer had sharp edges, but now carried questions. What home remained for them in a country that had surrendered? What kind of life waited in ruins, in cities that now glowed at night, not from lanterns, but from radiation? Could they return as daughters of an empire that no longer existed? After having seen the humanity of the men they'd been told were animals? One afternoon, as Michiko swept the edges of the sorting shed, she paused by a wall where the Lumberjacks had marked their height measurements and initials. She stared at them, inked symbols of existence, proud and simple. She reached into her apron pocket and pulled out a dull pencil stub. Then quietly she wrote, Mieto, not hiding, not in code, just her name. She ran her fingers over it, then stepped back. Walt passed by and paused, reading it. He said nothing, but after a moment, he reached into his shirt and added his own below hers. W. Redding, and beneath that, Ben's appeared. Then Jack's, then Yuki's, then Haru's, names on pine. Not as captors and captives, just people who had lifted the same wood. A week later, the order came. The women were to be processed for return to Japan before winter. There was no announcement, no ceremony. Just a single-page memo delivered to Corporal Thompson. She posted it quietly on the bulletin board outside the administration hut. By morning, every woman had read it. Not all spoke of it, but every glance was heavier, every gesture more deliberate, as if clinging to the last days of something sacred. That evening, as the sun bled orange through the treetops, Tomiko found Michiko sitting on the barrack steps. "You are quiet." "I am listening," Michiko replied. "To what?" "The birds." She looked up. "They do not worry about leaving." Tomiko nodded. "But they always come back." "No," Michiko said. "Not always. Some find new trees." 2 days later, the Lumberjacks hosted something no one expected. A farewell meal. It wasn't official. No flag, no brass band, no photographers. Just a cook fire, a few borrowed chairs, and crates flipped over for tables. Walt brought out a pot of stew. The men brewed coffee strong enough to strip paint. Someone passed around biscuits still warm from a civilian kitchen. The guards didn't interfere. They just watched from a distance, arms folded, respectful. Ben sat beside Haru and handed her a slice of peach cobbler wrapped in wax paper. She took it slowly. "For me?" He nodded. "Yes, for Haru." She blinked fast. Yuki, who once refused to even look an American in the eye, asked Jack what his hometown was like. He described Illinois winters, his father's cornfield, and the smell of bread cooling on windowsills. Yuki said nothing. But later, she drew a small sketch on scrap wood. A field, a tree, and a house with smoke from the chimney. She gave it to him before lights out. He kept it. As departure neared, the women asked if they could return to the lumber yard one last time. Not for work, but to say goodbye, Walt agreed. They wore their best uniforms that morning. Pressed, clean, with hair braided neatly. Michiko carried the carved bird Ben had given her. Haruo wore a small paper flower folded by one of the guards. Tomiko had nothing in her hands, but her eyes carried more than her arms ever could. When they arrived, the men were waiting. Ben stepped forward, hat in hand. He looked nervous. More nervous than he'd ever looked swinging an axe or hauling lumber. "I have a question," he said haltingly. Everyone paused. He turned to Michiko, his voice low. "When you go home, will you remember?" She didn't answer at first. Then she reached out and took his hand. Not as prisoner to guard, not as woman to man, but as one soul to another. "I will remember this place when I forget my own name," she said softly. "Because here, I learned it again." Ben's lips parted, but he said nothing. What else was there to say? They stood that way for a long moment, not moving, not pretending this was ordinary. Then someone, it was Jack maybe, began singing low. The Shenandoah, the old American folk song, worn and longing. "Long to see you." One by one, the other men joined in. Rough voices, unpracticed but honest. The women didn't know the words, but they understood the song. It was about rivers, about leaving, about carrying something in your heart that you cannot take in your hands. When it ended, no one clapped, no one spoke. The wind moved through the pine trees. A single leaf drifted to the ground between them, turning, before landing on soil neither foreign nor familiar. Just earth. Then Michiko, her voice steady, whispered in Japanese, "We did not lose the war here. We lost hatred." No one translated, but somehow they all understood. The news of departure spread quietly through the barracks, like the hush before a storm. Official papers had arrived, printed in English, read aloud by Corporal Thompson in soft tones that tried not to betray emotion. The 22 Japanese women, now formally classified as repatriated civilian internees, would board a military train in 2 weeks' time. Their final destination, the ruined ports of Yokohama. There was no ceremony, no special mention, Just an expiration date stamped onto their time in Texas. But something shifted. Not panic, not grief. Something more tender. Like the final night of summer, when the heat still lingers, but the wind smells faintly of endings. That evening, Michiko sat alone under the mess hall eave, watching dusk swallow the treetops. She held a pencil in her hand, tapping it rhythmically against a blank page. A letter, to whom she wasn't sure. She had no family left in Japan, at least none she knew to be alive. But still, the urge to write rose like sap through wood, steady, silent, impossible to deny. She began, "Dear someone, today I heard an axe split a log so cleanly it sounded like truth. The men here do not speak my language, and yet I understand them better than I understood some countrymen in uniform. They sweat, they laugh. They give us coffee when we cry and pretend they didn't see. One of them carved me a bird from pine. I think he did not know it meant freedom to me." She paused, then folded the paper carefully, even though she had no envelope, no address, no nation that would receive it. Others began writing too. Yuki asked Corporal Thompson for stationery. Harue borrowed a dull crayon from a military supply chest and filled a page with drawings, stick figures, saws, trees, little houses. At the bottom, she wrote in bold katakani, "Watashi wa ikite imasu." I am alive. Tomiko wrote nothing. But every night, she sat longer by the lamp, staring at a blank page as if daring it to speak first. The men noticed. Jack, the quiet one, began leaving paper scraps folded into cranes near the tool shed. Ben slipped a small pencil into Michiko's satchel one morning before she boarded the truck. On its side, he had etched, clumsily, "To remember." It was never said aloud, but everyone began to prepare. Not for goodbye, but for what would be left behind. One afternoon, Walt asked the women if they'd like to visit the lumber camp chapel. It wasn't religious pressure, just an invitation. A place of quiet where even noise had reverence. They hesitated, then agreed. The small building, made from rough-hewn wood, sat tucked among the trees. Inside, there were no pews, only benches, sunlight through slats, and the faint smell of cedar and wax. They sat. No prayers were spoken. No songs were sung. Just breath, just silence. Haru began to cry. It wasn't loud, just the soft, shaking kind, like a teapot whimpering before it whistles. Tomiko reached over and held her hand, and for a long time, they simply sat in stillness. 22 women who had once knelt for an emperor, now seated in the chapel of the people they were taught to hate. There was something sacred in that. Later that night, as they walked back to the barracks, Yuki said quietly, "In Tokyo, I saw churches burn." No one replied. "I thought buildings like that were made of lies." Still no reply. But maybe peace is not a building. Maybe it's a place inside someone else's eyes, when they look at you and don't see the enemy. On the final Sunday before departure, Walt brought a photographer. It was awkward at first. The women stood stiffly, unsure whether to smile, unsure what it would mean if they did. But then Ben stepped into the frame beside them, his arms crossed loosely, a soft smudge of sawdust still on his collar. He didn't say anything. He just stood beside Michiko and gave the faintest nod. She looked up at him, then turned to the camera and smiled. Not because she was told, but because it felt right. The shutter clicked. History made no sound. That night, Michiko wrote one final letter. "To the woman I used to be. You were taught to bow, to obey, to die before dishonor. You carried pride like a sword and silence like a shield. You believed Americans had no heart. But today, you drank coffee handed to you by a man named Ben. He has freckles. He works with wood. He carved a bird with crooked wings and gave it to you without asking for anything. You thought love could only be given to country or emperor. Now, you wonder if it can be found in sweat, in kindness, in the way someone pronounces your name. Gently, she folded the letter, then lit it with a match over a tin can. It burned fast. She did not cry. The smoke rose into the night like a spirit unchained. When the guards came the next morning to collect the trunks, they found the women standing in perfect rows, not as prisoners, but as something far older. Witnesses, witnesses to war, to survival, to a kind of mercy no uniform could enforce. One by one, they boarded the truck. Ben stood by the gate. When Michiko passed him, she stopped. She reached into her satchel and pulled out the carved bird, placed it in his hand. "It flies better in your country," she said in slow, broken English. Ben didn't move, but his hand tightened around the wooden wings. Then gently he whispered, "Sayonara, Michiko," and for the first time in months, she wept openly, not for what was lost, but for what had finally been found. The platform at Huntsville Station looked no different than it had months earlier. Sun-bleached boards, dust drifting in swirls across the gravel. Army guards posted at careful distance. Yet, to the 22 women standing in line beside their duffel bags, it was no longer a place of fear. It was a place of passage, a place between two selves. The train would take them to California. From there, by military transport ship, they would sail back to the shattered bones of the empire, to families they might never find again, to cities they might not recognize, and to a language of silence that now felt heavier than any uniform. They stood without speaking, but each carried something different. Haru clutched a crayon drawing of Texas hills wrapped in waxed cloth. Tomiko wore the folded crane that a young MP had handed her that morning, tucked into the fold of her blouse. Yuki kept her hands in her pockets, fingers curled around a scrap of wood shaped like a house. And Michiko carried nothing, except the memory of a voice that had said her name like it was something beautiful. Ben stood behind the line of guards, hat in hand. He didn't speak, he didn't call out. He just stood tall, boots planted firm in the red clay. When the whistle blew, a flock of birds startled from the trees. The women stepped forward, one by one. A few turned back, just slightly. Eyes searching the tree line, the yard, the sawmill smoke that still curled faintly in the distance. Yuki looked once at Jack. He raised a hand, barely. She nodded. Nothing more. When Michiko stepped onto the rail car, she turned at the top of the steps. Ben hadn't moved. But when her eyes found his, he did one small thing. He touched the breast pocket of his shirt, where the carved bird now rested. She bowed, once deeply, a gesture full of grief and gratitude, of distance and something unspoken that would never die. And then she turned away. The train doors closed. Inside, the wooden benches were hard, the windows streaked with dust. But the silence wasn't cold. It was reverent. No one cried, not loudly, but shoulders shivered, hands tightened. Voices tried to hum songs that broke halfway through. The landscape began to move outside. Slow trees, distant roads, barbed wire fading into brush. They passed fields where men worked tractors, small churches, water towers painted with towns' names. America, not as enemy, but as people. Somewhere near the third crossing, a conductor brought in boxed lunches, white bread sandwiches, apples, and a thermos of coffee. When he handed a box to Haru, he paused. "You girls work the yard?" Haru didn't understand, just blinked. He smiled softly. "Good work," then moved on. Haru stared at the sandwich for a long time, then took a bite. She whispered to no one, "It tastes like sawdust and something sweet." As the sun lowered, the train rocked gently, its steel wheels carving memory into every mile. Tomiko finally broke the silence. "What if, when we return," she said, "no one believes us?" Michiko looked out the window. "They won't? Then what was all of it for?" Michiko was quiet, then said, To remind us we are not the enemy we were trained to be. Tomiko let the words fall. She stared at her hands. I don't know if I belong to my country anymore, she whispered. Yuki, across from her, said simply, then belong to yourself. The train rolled through the last Texas towns, where strangers stood and waved, not knowing who was inside or what this journey meant. Children ran along the fence line, laughing. An old man tipped his cap. None of them saw prisoners, just passengers. And in that misrecognition, there was something holy. Later that night, beneath a flickering ceiling lamp, Michiko took out the final blank page from her satchel. She didn't write a letter. She didn't write a confession. She just drew. Not a bird, not a tree. A hand, calloused, gentle, open. Next to it, a second hand, hers, not touching, but close, enough to remember, enough to miss. When she fell asleep, the train was still moving, somewhere west of the Sabine River. In her dreams, she was walking through the pine forest again. But this time, alone. No guards, no barbed wire. Just the hush of needles underfoot and the smell of sap in the air. Then a sound, the slow rhythm of an axe. She followed it, and there, among the trees, stood Ben. But he wasn't chopping, he was carving. And when she approached, he looked up, smiled faintly, and handed her a small block of unfinished wood. You'll make the rest, he said. She woke with tears on her cheeks, and her fists curled into her blanket, not from sorrow, but because the dream had felt real. When the train reached El Paso, the sky was dark violet, and the desert stars glittered like memories not yet spoken. One by one, the women stepped off for fresh air, boots crunching against gravel. A young American sergeant lit a lantern and offered them water. He looked no older than 19. Michiko took the tin cup, drank deeply, and looked at him. He smiled. She smiled back. Another hand, another moment, another small piece. Behind them, the train engine hissed like a breath held too long. Ahead of them waited the ocean. And beyond that, ash, rubble, silence, and perhaps something waiting to grow again. But they had already buried the worst of the war. Right there, in a Texas forest, under pine needles and sawdust, in the shadow of men who swung axes without cruelty. They would return home, but they would never be the same. Because a part of them, the part that remembered how their names were spoken, how their hands were held, how the world could be different, had stayed behind. And maybe that was the part that was most worth keeping. The sea was not kind. Even in peacetime, it had its temper. Waves lifted and dropped the transport ship like a hand slowly tightening and loosening its grip. Salt clung to every rail, every window pane, every thread of clothing. The sky was gray for days at a time, as if the heavens themselves were mourning something unseen. But it wasn't the sea that made the crossing hard. It was what the women carried. They had boarded as civilians, not soldiers. Their war, officially, was over. There were no salutes, no victory parades, no medals awaiting them on the other side. Just silence, just return. And yet, within each woman's satchel or coat pocket or folded sleeve, something else traveled with them. Fragments of Texas. Haru kept her wax-wrapped drawing close, often unfolding it at night under the dim light of the ship's cabin. She whispered names to herself, of men who had spoken kindly, of trees that had shaded her workbench, of the way the harmonica sounded just before dusk. Yuki wore her small wooden house on a string around her neck. She never took it off, not even when the storm hit and waves crashed high against the portholes. Tomiko didn't carry an object. Instead, she carried a phrase, one she repeated like prayer when no one else could hear. Belong to yourself. And Michiko, she carried memory. She carried it in the way she stood at the railing each morning, letting the wind tangle her hair, in the way her hands sometimes closed gently around invisible shapes. A bird, a hand, a pencil, in the way her name, once spoken only in interrogation rooms and officer roll calls, now echoed in her own heart like a lullaby. There was no ceremony upon arrival, just the clank of anchor chain and the call of seagulls. The dock at Yokohama was quieter than expected. Half-collapsed buildings lined the skyline, steel ribs exposed like broken spines. American MPs guided them gently down the gangplank, avoiding eye contact. Perhaps they expected resentment, or worse, despair. But the women walked steadily, slowly, like people learning how to step into their own story again. A Japanese official read off names from a list. His voice was formal, brittle. When he called Michiko Ito, he didn't look up. She answered clearly, "Hi." No hesitation, no shame. They were processed into temporary housing, a camp of former barracks on the outskirts of the city, surrounded by fields turned to mud. There were no jobs waiting, no families meeting them with open arms, just ruins and questions. One morning, a young officer asked Tomiko what she had done during internment. He expected the usual: farm labor, detention, clerical support. She answered simply, "I worked in the forest." He blinked. "The forest?" "Yes," she said, staring directly at him. "With men who use their hands to build, not destroy." He said nothing after that, but something changed in his face. A week passed, then another. Letters were sent to addresses that no longer existed. Some returned unopened. Some disappeared into the broken postal system, like coins dropped into water. Still, the women waited, and slowly, they began to rebuild, not buildings, not yet, but trust. Haru volunteered at a field clinic. Yuki helped rebuild a school. Tomiko found work sorting food rations in a government warehouse. And Michiko? She began to write, not to Ben. She knew a letter might never reach him. There were too many barriers: oceans, governments, language, time. But she wrote anyway. "Dear Ben, I remember the sound of the saws in the rain. I remember how you said my name with care, not command. I remember the bird you carved, though I left it with you, because I wanted you to remember me too. Even if our countries forget, even if the world forgets, even if history reduces us to a footnote in a dusty archive, I will not forget you." She folded the letter, slipped it into a wooden box, and buried it beneath a plum tree behind the refugee barracks. Some memories, she decided, didn't need postage, just roots. The years would pass. They would all change. Some of the women would marry, others never would. Some would speak of Huntsville only in whispers. Others would carry it like a lantern in their chest, quiet but glowing. The war would be remembered in textbooks and headlines. But their part, the human part, would live on in invisible places. In the way Haru always brewed coffee for guests, even when tea was more traditional. In the way Yuki insisted her children fold their origami birds with care, not as toys, but as prayers. In the way Tomiko, who never remarried, placed a paper crane on her windowsill every year on the day of departure. And in the way Michiko, decades later, would pause while walking through a Tokyo lumberyard, run her fingers across the grain of a pine beam, and whisper, "Texas," because the war had not ended with surrender. It had ended here, on a train, in a lumberyard, in the sound of a foreign man saying her name not with suspicion, but with respect. And that was a victory history books would never record, but hearts would never forget. Many seasons passed. Wars changed names, borders shifted, empires came and went like dust on the wind. But Camp Huntsville faded quietly, not with explosions or fire, but with grass, rain, and time. The barracks were dismantled. The fences came down. The sawmill was long gone, reclaimed by saplings and silence. Only the tall East Texas pines remained, rooted deep into the memory of the land. They had stood during war. They stood now in peace. And beneath those trees, unseen by most, something else endured. A story, not of battles, but of hands reaching across lines drawn in blood. Not of surrender, but of recognition. Not of nations, but of names. It was 1970 when Michiko returned, not as a prisoner, not as a ghost, but as a woman nearing 50, with streaks of silver in her hair and a paper folder tucked carefully under her arm. She came alone, dressed in a simple gray coat, her steps slow but steady as she walked down the overgrown path that once led to the yard. The train from Houston had left her in a quiet town now grown strange and unfamiliar. But when she stepped off the platform, the scent of pine was the same. She followed it like a thread. When she reached the clearing where the lumber camp had once stood, she stopped. Grass had swallowed the old foundations. Wildflowers pushed through cracks in concrete. A rusted nail, half buried in the dirt, winked up at her like an old friend. She knelt, pressed her palm to the earth, and whispered, "I came back." In her hands was a sketchbook, its pages worn and yellowed, filled with drawings from memory. She had drawn the barracks, the Lumberjacks' shed, the chapel with its crooked roof, and page after page of hands. Folding, carving, lifting timber, passing bread, holding nothing and everything. She sat on a stump and flipped slowly through them, as if searching for a voice inside. And when she reached the last page, the one she had left blank for decades, she took out a pencil and began to draw a bird, but not the one Ben had carved for her. This one had no cage, wings stretched wide, caught in mid-flight, not flying away, not toward war, just flying. That evening, as the sun folded itself into the horizon, Michiko walked to the edge of the field where the pine trees met the sky. She placed the sketchbook in the hollow of an old stump, the same one, perhaps, where Jack had once rested during lunch breaks. Then she sat beside it and watched the shadows stretch. She spoke aloud, not for the trees, but for those who might one day listen. There are wars we survive with bullets and rations, and there are others we survive with kindness. Texas gave me no flag, no certificate, no medal, but it gave me a name again. It gave me a moment when someone looked at me and saw not an enemy, not a prisoner, just a person. And that is the freedom I carry. Some say memory is a burden, but for Michiko, it was a seed, and she had watered it every year with silence, letters never sent, and prayers folded into the shape of cranes. Now, as the wind rustled the branches, she stood slowly, brushed the pine needles from her coat, and turned toward the path. She would return to Japan the next day, but a part of her would remain here, not buried, not hidden, planted. In the years that followed, children on school trips would find a weathered notebook inside a hollow stump on what was now called the Huntsville Memorial Trail. They wouldn't recognize the name written in delicate script. They wouldn't know the face in the small hand-drawn portrait. But they'd pause at the bird on the final page, its wings wide, its beak open mid-song, and wonder why it made them feel something they couldn't name. A ranger once found a child crying beside the stump and asked what was wrong. The boy just said, "She flew home," and the ranger, not knowing what it meant, simply nodded. In another part of Texas, an old man named Ben, now gray, with shaking hands, kept a small wooden bird on a shelf above his workbench. He never told his children where it came from, but every year, on the same day in October, he would sit on the porch, sip strong black coffee, and stare east, toward the forest line. Sometimes, if the wind was right, he swore he could hear her voice in the trees, not saying goodbye, just remembering. Because the war had ended long ago, but something better had endured. Not victory, not vengeance, but a memory shared between two souls, one who carried a name and one who remembered how to speak it gently. And in that forest where hatred once took root, mercy had grown, quietly, strongly, like pine, forever.